Hello and welcome to American Catholic History, brought to you by the support of listeners like you. If you like our podcast, please become a supporter. Also, be sure to give us a 5-star rating and a great review wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crowe.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Today, we're talking about the first American-born person to be canonized, Elizabeth Ann Bailey Seton.
And this is an opportunity to sort of split some hairs. For decades, Seton has been recognized as the first American-born saint. She is the first person who was born on this continent to be canonized, but she isn't the first U.S. citizen to be canonized, nor was she the earliest person to die and go straight to heaven.
Right. Well, the first U.S. citizen to be canonized was St. Frances Xavier Cabrini. She was an amazing woman in her own right, but she was born in Italy and later became an American citizen. On the other hand, St. Kateri Tekakwitha was born and raised in what is now New York. She died and went to heaven 94 years before St. Elizabeth Ann Seton was born, though she was canonized 37 years after Seton.
So, and not that it matters because they're all before the throne of God, but it's the sort of thing that we here on earth notice and talk about. That means that Seton wasn't the first American to become a saint in heaven, nor was she the first U.S. citizen, but she was the earliest living native-born American to be canonized. Do you follow?
Well, I mean, as you say, it doesn't ultimately matter, but it gives us, or, well, at least you, something to talk about.
Yes, and I've talked about it long enough. Let's go to the life and story of that first American-born saint, Elizabeth Ann Seton.
Well, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton has one of those riches to rags to riches stories that appear in so many saints. She was born into wealth, and much of her life was filled with comfort and privilege. You wouldn't necessarily have pegged her for sanctity, but there were some early indications, and then some tragedies, which made a profound difference in her later years.
Yes, indeed.
So, let's talk about those early years.
Okay, she was born in August of 1774 in New York City, the second daughter of Dr. Richard Bailey and his first wife, Catherine, née Charlton. Both the Bailey and Charlton families had been among the earliest settlers of the New York area. Both were very well respected.
And at this point, it also meant that they were Anglican.
Yes, as all respectable people were. And thus, Elizabeth was destined to be raised a keen member of the Church of England.
Well, the Episcopal Church, as it came to be known in America after the Revolution.
Right. So Dr. Bailey, her father, was a very well-to-do and very important physician in New York. His work took him away from home a good deal. In 1777, when Elizabeth was 3 years old, her mother died. Richard was distraught, but he knew his daughters, Elizabeth and her older sister Mary, needed a mother. So just 1 year later, he married again, this time to another daughter of prominence, Charlotte Barclay. Her family lines included Roosevelt blood, so we're still talking about some of the oldest families around.
The marriage to Charlotte was initially very happy, and together they had 5 additional children. But the happiness did not last. After a time, Charlotte began to favor her own children over Mary and Elizabeth. Eventually, she cut relations with them, sending them to live with their father's brother and sister-in-law in the countryside of upstate New York. Elizabeth was only about 10 years old at this point and had lost her second mother figure, the first to death, the second to rejection.
The time spent at their uncle and aunt's home was not lost, though. Elizabeth spent much time outdoors and developed a great appreciation for nature and the peace found there. She spent time riding horses, learning to play piano, and, importantly, poring over Scripture. She developed a great capacity for contemplation and wondering about the stories she read in the Bible, a foundation that would serve her well later in life.
After Dr. Bailey separated from Charlotte, Mary and Elizabeth were brought back to the city. Elizabeth grew and became a fashionable teenager with all the privileges and connections that a girl of her lineage and social class should have. She attended the right parties, she was part of the right circle of friends. Everyone knew who Elizabeth Bailey was, and many undoubtedly wanted to be her.
In January of 1794, when she was 19 years old, Elizabeth married William McGee Seton, the wealthy heir of a shipping and mercantile firm founded by his father. Like Elizabeth Ann Bailey, William McGee Seton was also the child of very prominent families of New York, and they were among the wealthiest. So this wedding was that one sensational event of the season. It was like, John F. Kennedy and Jackie Bouvier. They were married by Samuel Provost, who was the first Episcopal bishop of New York.
It was huge. And it was a very successful, very happy marriage. They had 5 children and things were going well. They were good friends with their neighbors on and around Wall Street, including Alexander Hamilton.
You mean the guy in the musical?
Yeah, the guy from the musical.
Wow. Too bad they didn't write the Setons into the story.
Well, considering how many parts of Hamilton's life they got wrong in the musical, that may not be a bad thing.
Yeah, you're not kidding.
They took a lot of creative license.
Yeah. So William Seton traveled a good deal on behalf of the family firm. He crossed to Europe often, which brought him to Italy more than once. There, he developed a friendship with Antonio and Filippo Filicchi. The Filicchis were brothers who were business associates of William Seton. This relationship will become important very soon.
As William traveled, Elizabeth remained in New York, living the life of a wife of a prominent and wealthy businessman. She also became known for her Christian charity, her efforts to care for others, and her deep religious sentiment. With her sister-in-law Rebecca and other like-hearted women, Elizabeth set up the Society for the Relief of Poor Widows with Children to help those afflicted by disease outbreaks.
So even before she became Catholic, Elizabeth Ann Seton had a heart and a drive for helping others.
Yeah, she sure did.
Things began to unravel for the Setons, however, at the end of the 1790s. First, troubles between the United Kingdom and France meant difficulties for American shipping companies. Ships were boarded and business dried up. Those problems were compounded by a couple of ships being lost at sea. In 1798, William's father suddenly died, leaving William in charge of the shipping firm and responsible for his younger siblings who were not yet able to live on their own. William himself had been battling tuberculosis for much of their marriage, and all of this additional stress made him less strong to fight it.
In 1801, the Seton shipping firm was forced to declare bankruptcy. By the year's end, the Setons were destitute, and William's health was nearing crisis point. The only thing to do was to get to a warmer climate and hope his health rallied. So they contacted his old friends, the Filicchis. In October of 1803, William, Elizabeth, and their eldest daughter, Anna Maria, made the crossing to Italy, landing in the port city of Livorno.
The reception in Italy was cold, however, and we mean that literally. Due to a yellow fever outbreak in New York, the health officials in Livorno determined that the Setons had to stay in quarantine for a month. That might not have been so bad, but the seaside stone tower where they were kept was perhaps the worst possible place for a man with tuberculosis. William's condition worsened further. The Filicchis protested, but it made no difference. Just 2 weeks after they were released from quarantine, William died. Elizabeth was at her lowest. At just 29 years old, she had nothing and was the widowed mother of 5.
But out of the deepest depths come the highest heights, if we just trust God.
Yeah, he's confounding like that, isn't he?
Often, yes. The Filicchis were Catholic, and while staying with them in Pisa and Florence, Elizabeth began to question them about their faith.
She really hadn't known Catholics back in America. I mean, there were Catholics around, but not in polite circles, you know.
But the sacraments, the Memorare prayer, and public acts of devotion, in particular to the Blessed Sacrament, piqued her curiosity. The brothers and their wives were happy to answer her questions.
Elizabeth Ann and Anna Maria were forced to stay in Italy until April 1804, and that gave her more time to realize that her questions of faith were no longer just academic or idle curiosities. The devotion of these Catholics, particularly to the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, had grabbed a hold of her. She needed to pursue this, even if it meant becoming Catholic. Back in America, her friends and relations, including her Anglican ministers, were happy to support the widowed mother of 5, the former fashionable socialite good Anglican woman.
They were happy to, that is, until she began expressing to them that she was considering becoming Catholic. Suddenly, the support dried up.
The Filicchis stepped in to continue to support her both financially and spiritually. They sent money as well as books on Catholicism. Eventually, through much soul-searching and prayer, she decided she must become Catholic. She was received into the church on March 14, 1805, at St. Peter Parish on Barclay Street.
St. Peter Parish figures in a number of Catholic stories. It was the first Catholic parish in New York, the city, and the state, and a whole lot of American Catholic history has some connection to that parish. It was only 20 years old at the time Elizabeth Ann was received into the church in 1805.
And 1 year later, likely in a ceremony also held in St. Peter, Elizabeth Ann was confirmed by Baltimore's Bishop John Carroll. Remember, Baltimore was still the only diocese in the country. New York wasn't a diocese until 1808.
To make money, Elizabeth Ann basically turned her home into a boarding school for girls. She had had experience teaching many children after her husband's younger siblings moved in, so teaching was something she could do. But as news of her conversion to Catholicism spread, many families withdrew their daughters.
About that time, she met Father William Louis Dubourg. Father Dubourg, another figure who will get his own episode eventually, was a Sulpician priest who had fled France to avoid the bloody reign of terror ravaging that country. In the U.S., he was the founding president-rector of the brand-new St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore, and he had been looking for someone to establish a school for the children of the growing Catholic community, particularly the girls. Elizabeth Ann Seton, he thought, could fit the bill, and thus the next phase of her life began.
Dubourg and Bishop Carroll worked together to bring Seton to Baltimore, where they helped her set up a small school for local children. But all three of them were quickly working toward a larger goal, a system of Catholic schools that would be free for those who could not afford to pay.
Now, the secular public schools at the time actually charged tuition and were expensive, so only the upper classes could afford them. This means that what Carroll, Dubourg, and Seton were planning was revolutionary.
To make it a reality, Carroll and Dubourg knew that a woman's religious community would be needed, and they knew that Mother Seton was a fitting head of the establishment. They wanted to bring over Daughters of Charity from France, the order founded by St. Vincent de Paul and St. Louise de Marillac, but ongoing turmoil there prevented passage.
So instead, they helped Seton establish something new with the intention of connecting it to that order eventually. They helped her to recruit women from all over the country to join her fledgling community. Then they helped to establish the rule of life along the same lines as the Daughters of Charity.
One benefit of this type of religious life was that it allowed women in the community who were widowed with children to continue to raise their children. The Seton children ranged from 13 to 7, so Elizabeth Ann was still very much a mother.
As the community grew and plans began to coalesce, now Archbishop Carroll decided to formally establish the community as the Sisters of Charity of St. Joseph, and on March 25, 1809, he received the solemn vows of Elizabeth Ann Seton. The Sisters of Charity of St. Joseph were born, and Elizabeth Ann Seton was now and forever known as Mother Seton.
The next major development was the establishment of their permanent location. Baltimore itself had been their home for the past few years, but it was not to be their long-term home. That distinction fell upon another very Catholic locality, Emmitsburg, Maryland.
Yeah, Emmitsburg is an intriguing little town among the mountains in north-central Maryland. The Catholic presence there has fascinating beginnings, and it has been a great source of grace for the Church in America. Not only did Mother Seton establish her religious order and a school there, but when she arrived, it was already home of Father John Dubois and his brand-new seminary and college, Mount St. Mary's, which has also blessed the Church with many bishops, priests, and important Catholic leaders.
We've already told the story of the remarkable life of John Dubois in another episode, but there are a number of other stories connected to the tiny town of Emmitsburg and Mount St. Mary's. One of them is the very interesting man who made the next step of Mother Seton's story possible. This was Samuel Sutherland Cooper.
Samuel Sutherland Cooper was a seminarian at St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore. He was quite a bit wealthier and more world-wise than the typical seminarian. He had been a sailor and a successful sea captain, so he had made lots of money sailing around the world until he left that life, became Catholic, and entered seminary. It was while a seminarian that one day he lamented to his spiritual director that there was no major educational establishment for Catholic girls, and told him that he'd devote a significant sum of money to make this happen.
Well, his spiritual director was fairly floored because just that very morning, Elizabeth Ann Seton, who was another of his spiritual directees, had told him that she believed that God intended for Samuel Sutherland Cooper to give her the money she needed to establish a school. The priest had forbidden her to approach him, assuring her that if it were God's will, Cooper would also be drawn in that direction.
And, well, here he was, saying basically the other side of the same thing on the same day.
Sometimes God is not subtle.
No, not at all. So Cooper gave Mother Seton $10,000, that's well more than $250,000 today, to purchase land and build buildings in Emmitsburg, and off Mother Seton went.
Mother Seton and her band of charitable women arrived in Emmitsburg in June of 1809. That month, the rest of the women in the order agreed to adopt the same manner of dress that Mother Seton maintained as a widow, the black dress, leather belt with rosary hanging from it, and bonnet. This basically became their habit.
Their new home was in a valley at the northwest end of Mary's Mountain, so Mother Seton named it St. Joseph's Valley, and the girls' school which she founded there was, of course, named St. Joseph Academy.
So Mount St. Mary's was the boys' school, and right around the corner was St. Joseph for the girls.
Exactly. The life of the sisters was rough in Emmitsburg, but it was filled with grace. They taught at the school, and they maintained a strict life of prayer and labor. Mother Seton was also involved over on Mary's Mountain near Mount St. Mary's. There's actually a rock near the grotto of Our Lady of Lourdes that is known to be where Mother Seton would sit when teaching the faith. She was connected with two other prominent personages from Mount St. Mary's of that era.
The first was her spiritual director, Father Simon Broutet, the French priest who was a co-worker with Father Dubourg. He was responsible for keeping the mount open at a time of peril, and he became the first bishop of Vincennes, Indiana.
The other was a rough-and-tumble Irish lad who did the gardening at Mount St. Mary's. He aspired to be a priest, but he had a real hard time with his grades. Father Dubois intended to dismiss this lad entirely from formation and just let him remain the gardener, but Mother Seton saw the quality of the man and pressed Dubois to pass him through. And it's a good thing she did, and Dubois relented, because that man was John Hughes, and many years later he actually succeeded Dubois as Bishop of New York. Broutet has his own episode. Hughes will eventually get his own.
Well, we've said that a lot today. So many of these great stories intertwine.
Yes, absolutely.
It's just one of the cool things
Yeah.
about the early history of the church.
Mother Seton led the community through great growth. In 1811, the Sisters of Charity of St. Joseph officially adopted a modified version of the rule of the French Daughters of Charity. It wasn't until the 1850s that the Sisters of Charity of St. Joseph finally succeeded in fully joining the French order, as Mother Seton had always wanted.
But Mother Seton also endured personal tragedies. In 1812, her beloved daughter Anna Maria died from tuberculosis shortly before her 17th birthday. And just a few years later, in 1816, her youngest daughter Rebecca also succumbed to tuberculosis. Even as the order grew, it also suffered losses of younger sisters to tuberculosis, and eventually that horrible disease also came for Mother Seton.
It was in summer of 1820 when the illness first set in for Mother Seton. Her condition worsened as the fall and then the winter wore on, until in early January she finally realized that the end was near. On January 3rd, in refusing her medicine, she said, "Never mind the drink, one communion more, and then eternity." Early the next morning, January 4th, 1821, Mother Seton died. She was just 46 years old. After her death, the Sisters of Charity expanded all over. By 1830, they had established schools as far west as Cincinnati and New Orleans, as well as the first hospital west of the Mississippi in St. Louis.
As for Mother Seton's surviving family, her only remaining daughter, Catherine, became the first American woman to join the Irish religious order, the Sisters of Mercy, eventually coming to be known as Mother Mary Catherine. She lived to the ripe old age of 91, and as of 2019, Her order has begun the initial phases of a cause for sainthood, so possibly 2 Seton saints.
That'd be kind of cool. It could happen. And as for her 2 sons, both William and Richard joined the U.S. Navy. William had a long career, while Richard died at sea in 1823 at just 25 years old. Because of this connection, shortly after her canonization, Mother Seton was proclaimed the patroness of the sea services, the Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and the Merchant Marines, by then Monsignor John O'Connor, who was the head of Navy chaplains at the time.
Mother Seton was beatified in 1963 by Pope St. John XXIII. He said at the beatification, "In a house that was very small, but with ample space for charity, she sowed a seed in America which, by divine grace, grew into a large tree." Her canonization was just 12 years later in 1975. At the Mass, Pope St. Paul VI said, "Elizabeth Ann Seton is a saint. Elizabeth Ann Seton is an American. All of us say this with special joy and with the intention of honoring the land and the nation from which she sprang forth as the first flower in the calendar of the saints. Elizabeth Ann Seton was wholly American. Rejoice for your glorious daughter, be proud of her, and know how to preserve her fruitful heritage." May we all work to do just that. This has been American Catholic History. If you enjoy American Catholic history, please become a supporter. Get information on how to become a supporter at americancatholichistory.org/support.
Also on our website, sign up for our newsletter, learn more about St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, see about our pilgrimages, and find other great stories from American Catholic history.
We also love the great reviews our listeners leave. Those and the 5-star ratings help others find us. You can email us feedback, questions, tips for episode topics, or other comments at feedback@americancatholichistory.org. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/American Catholic History, on Instagram at ACH_podcast, and follow us on X at ACH1513. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crow.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Thanks for listening to American Catholic History, brought to you by the support of listeners like you.